Yeah, and it's my pleasure to introduce Taj as the first speaker of Trinity Term 2025. Trinity Term is the one when it's sunny, so all the more good to have you here in the room or online. Thank you very much. And Taj is Professor for Energy and Environment at the Energy Institute at UCL, which is one of those institutions that, for as long as I've been in the sector, has been sort of a shining beacon in the energy demand research world. And that not only says how long I've been in this space, the Institute was actually, Taj was the founding director of the Energy Institute, which is now, yeah, really one of those places where we from Oxford we also look with some envy of how much energy research is going on there. And Taj has also been one of the leading lights in a research program that was very close to our heart here too, the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, which Taj led with Nick and really made huge inroads. And the other reason I'm especially fond of Taj's work and always been looking towards it is we're sort of a similar school. There are people who like to do bottom-up architecture assessment of what a building does or should be doing. And both Taj and I love to actually ground that in data and collect data and sort of verify if what we expect a building to do is actually what it does in practice. And that's exactly Taj's topic today. He's going to ground us with empirical data on what buildings do. So I really look forward to hearing from you, Taj.
Thanks. Those very, very kind words. And thanks for everybody who's joining us online as well. I appreciate it's a gloriously sunny day today. And if I had an option, I would probably not be listening to somebody talking about domestic energy modelling, but making use of the really today that we've got. So my presentation today really is a personal reflection of domestic energy modelling. For one purpose, I'm really going to be focusing on the purpose and the application of energy rating of buildings. And ultimately looking at how accurate it is. That's really my focus. However, we often think as models in sort of isolation from the ecosystem they're used in and were developed for. And even if they're purely research tools, modelling really is a bit of an art form as well as a science. And so it's important to realise the context of the model, what it's developed for and how it's being applied and what it's being used for. I'm not saying I'm going to focus on one particular case. But just again to set the scene, probably a third of academic papers in the energy and buildings area are probably based on some form of energy or environmental modelling work. And so, you know, they are very, very heavily used. And many of you will probably also be aware of the sort of replication crisis, areas of research where results cannot be replicated, and psychology has been very heavily hit by that. We actually tried to get a research proposal funded about 5 years ago to see if this applied to energy modelling as well. Whether you could actually replicate results with you know, your own models and things, but struggle to get any funding. I suspect because the research proposals were reviewed by modelers who really appreciated that particular narrative that we might have. So I'm going to start by setting the scene, why this area is so important, before giving a bit of history about domestic energy rating, some of you may or may not be aware of, and then showing the results of comparing model data with empirical data, and then concluding by sharing a few sort of personal reflections, what I've learned from looking at modelling of domestic energy properties. The smart meter data that I'll present results from have been collected under 2 Research Council grants, the Smart Energy Research Lab and EDOL, the Energy Demand Observatory and Laboratory. And EDOL is a collaborative project between Oxford and UCL, so it's really great to be here presenting some results that we've had from looking at the smart meter data that we've collected under those 2 programs. And the analysis of this data has been partly funded by the Department of Energy and Security and Net Zero. The results that I'm going to be presenting have been generated by my colleagues, Jess, Minnie, Daniel. I'd like to thank them for agreeing to let me present them. I'm sure I won't do justice to the results, and any mistakes are purely mine. I'm also very happy to take any questions as we go along and points of clarification. I'm very happy for that. But I also might find it difficult to see people's hands online, so feel free to shout out if you want to.
Is there?
Is this?
Yeah, it needs to be. Yeah.
Sure, I'll use this. I'll use the mouse.
Will it work?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. So I just thought of, in terms of setting the scene, I'll just talk a little bit about how energy consumption in the domestic sector has changed over time. And the good news is that over the last 2 decades, domestic energy consumption has been reducing, and it's partly been reducing because our buildings have become more energy efficient, our appliances have become more energy efficient. We've sort of probably saturated thermal comfort, taking in some sectors of the population, not all of them at all, but some sectors have been saturated. And of course, fuel prices have rapidly increased over the last few decades. We didn't see the reduction in energy consumption in previous decades over here, because we were expanding our building stock. We were heating more of our homes because we deployed central heating, and we were heating them to a higher temperature because we had a very low temperature historically. And fuel prices were also reducing during that period of time. Actually. But probably more of an interesting graph from my perspective anyway is the graph that you see here on the right, which is a form of energy signature graph. And I'll talk more about energy signatures later on when we talk about analysing some of the data we've been looking at. But it shows you the total energy demand and how it changes with external temperature. And this is using quarterly energy consumption. And what it really highlights is the incredible importance in the future energy system of domestic energy consumption. All buildings' energy consumption in the winter period is responsible for over half of the winter quarters' energy consumption. And so the size of the energy system, the amount of energy storage we will have to have, is critically dependent on what happens to this element and this gradient here over time. And that's obviously affected by things like the energy efficiency of the building and the heating system. Over the next sort of couple of decades, there's got 3 technologies that we're really going to have to deploy massively to achieve net zero. We're going to have offshore wind, electric vehicles, and heat pumps, and they just have to be deployed almost everywhere we possibly can if we're to stand any chance of achieving the targets we're looking for. Plus, everything's got to be more efficient. We've got to have PV storage, etc. So the domestic sector is critical to the future energy system. And I would argue that energy ratings play one of the key roles in terms of a tool for policymakers to reduce energy demand and to potentially make buildings more energy efficient. So probably half of you in the room and online have got an energy performance certificate. And you've probably paid between £70 and £100 to get one of these whenever you've rented a property or purchased a property. So if I've just paid £500,000 for a house with a SAP of 42 and EPC band of E, what is it telling me? Would you like to hazard a guess? What is your EPC actually telling you?
Yes.
Well, if you were thinking it would telling you the energy efficiency and you were a building scientist, that at this point klaxons should be going off in lights flashing as it does on QI, when you say the obvious thing. You know, when you're having an energy efficiency rating, surely it's telling you the energy efficiency. If you're an economist, you're probably half right, that actually the EPC is sort of telling you something about the energy efficiency in terms of the services provided at a cost, because the EPC rating is very much based on fuel cost. And at this point, I can't help but to remind everybody about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And if you're a modeler of any sort, it's a must read. It has to be your core reference. For those of you who haven't read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Deep Thought is a supercomputer built by a race of hyper-intelligent beings to calculate the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And after 7.5 million years of computation, Deep Thought finally reveals that the answer is simply 42. When asked to clarify, Deep Thought explains, I think the problem, to be quite honest with you, is that you never actually know what the question is. And very often that is a problem with the way that EPCs and SAPs are used, is people forget what the question is. And the temptation is obviously to try and produce something that answers the question, that answers every question to do with energy use of buildings. And EPCs don't do that. After Deep Thought, what they did was that they, to find out the ultimate answer, what the question is, you need to build an even more powerful computer, which turns out to be the Earth itself. And I think we need to be careful that we don't end up building even more complicated models to think that they're going to answer every question just for the sake of it. I think that's a lessons learned. So one of the results of running an energy performance certificate is that it will predict and make recommendations for you to have a more energy efficient building, at the same time as giving you a rating for your existing building. And this is a list of the recommendations that the 26 million EPCs that have been created have given homes. So the scale on the bottom, which unfortunately has been cut off, is many, many millions. So these are big bars. One of the most popular measures was one highly recommended by a notorious Prime Minister, David Cameron, who insisted we should perhaps think about having wind turbines on our roofs. He also was the instigator of the vote for Brexit, so I'm not sure how those two things are related. But wind turbines are recommended on over 1 million EPCs, and you would be crazy to put a wind turbine on your house. That's not to say there's a massive role for wind turbines, but their role is not integrated into buildings, but to be in the North Sea, where they actually generate a lot of very cost-effective energy, not in a sheltered location as you get on a building. But not one EPC recommends a heat pump. And so, you know, there was 3 technologies I was talking about that had to be introduced. One of those was wind turbines, but not on your building in the North Sea. The other one was heat pumps, and the third is EVs. But there isn't one EPC that recommends a heat pump. And the reason being that the EPC is based on fuel cost. And if you look at the ratio of electricity to gas prices over time, the ratio has always been about 3 to 4 over time. And that means that your heat pump has to be 3 to 4 times more efficient than your gas boiler, which in many cases, historically, they haven't been. And so for that reason, with the way the EPCs model heat pumps, not using time of use tariffs or any sophisticated calculations, which nowadays you ideally would want to do, you end up with the result that heat pumps don't actually get recommended because they're not seen to be cost effective from the SAP calculation. Now, a lot of people use this result to simply say, well, let's trash EPCs, let's get rid of them, or let's make the metric different. Let's not use a price metric, but use a kilowatt hours metric. some other metric, CO2 or something. I think we have to be careful about that. And I'll explain a little bit more about this, but the reason why we need to be careful about that is that that is one solution to getting, we can come up with a different metric that makes heat pumps attractive. But that will still probably mean they're not very cost effective. And so many people will not be encouraged to use it. Surely a better thing to do would be to change the relative price of gas to electricity. And then that problem would disappear. And there is no fundamental reason nowadays why the price of electricity has to be tagged to the price of gas. It's a historic pricing mechanism, that market mechanism that we've used, which really is no longer applicable to the current day situation. So just to sort of lay a bit more of the background on history of ratings, you're probably very well aware that almost everything has an energy rating these days: cars, homes, fridges, light bulbs, etc. Appliances. Building energy rating has particular challenges, I would argue. Buildings are not normally mass produced to a high standard. We build lots of buildings of a similar type, but there isn't a high replicability like there is with a car. And so with cars, you can drive them around a test track, you can drive one car around a test track, and you can probably expect most cars coming off the production line would have a similar thing if they were driven around the same test track.
Have wing mirrors on for field cars.
And cars tend to get used for one purpose, which is moving from A to B, whereas obviously buildings get used in many, many different ways. So models are generally used for testing, for producing energy ratings, as opposed to physical testing, which is often used in other rating schemes. One of the challenges with almost all rating schemes, and comparing it to any real monitor data, is that you're rating the technology, not the technology with the normal occupant behaviours variation. So an energy rating will never predict what your house or your car will use in terms of energy. It's assuming a standard behaviour and occupancy. You would hope that that standard behaviour and occupancy is similar to the average, otherwise it wouldn't really be telling you much usefulness. And that's what we're going to be looking at later on. So the first energy rating is now 40 years old. So we've had energy ratings in buildings for that long. It was originally tested in the Milton Keynes Energy Cost Index in 1984, when we developed, Bredown was developed into a rating for rating homes in Milton Keynes. That then evolved into a national home energy rating system, and then that evolved into the SAP and EPC system. We've had various attempts at calibration using field data, but the field data has been relatively small sample sizes, very often less than 100 homes, and largely in new homes historically, or through things like the English Housing Survey, where there's been very little sort of very little energy monitor data to do the comparison with. It's interesting to go back to some of the original papers actually on the Milton Keynes Energy Cost Index, and what's really clear is that there was some very clear set of aims and objectives for the original energy rating schemes. It was to inform owners when comparing one house against another, and also to act as a regulatory method. As I said, the metric wasn't energy, but energy cost as the key performance metric, as it's what homeowners were interested in, and that's why it was chosen. And there were some interesting sort of philosophies behind the original development of it. The original development was to only model significant factors. No point in knowing something very, very accurately if it didn't really have a big impact on the energy performance, if you didn't know other things accurately. And so, you know, something like the ventilation rate, we still don't know very accurately in a home, and yet it can have a very big impact. And its philosophy was really to reduce data input because of this relationship between sort of accuracy versus complexity. As you increase the model complexity and the number of data items that you need, the modeling error reduces. The model gets better because you have more information. But as you have to collect more information, you can potentially collect data errors. And the combination of those sort of suggests that there's a sweet spot somewhere. And that sweet spot will change depending on the complexity of the model, but also as the ability to collect more accurate data is developed. And there are now mechanisms, for example, to perhaps measure the floor area of a house more accurately using LiDAR data than it might be to send somebody around to actually measure its actual dimensions. Part of the reason why there was a lot of interest in all of this in the early days was that you couldn't guarantee that everybody had a computer when SAPs were originally designed. And so that actually resulted in this philosophy. But I would argue that now, as computers have got so easy to use, and so easy to model anything, and in fact, ChatGPT, you can put it on to do anything if you are that way inclined. The complexity gets much, much larger. But there is still this issue of error in data entry, error in collecting the accurate data, and the cost associated with that. So 4 decades on after the energy sort of rating, the systems have evolved from the Milton Keynes Energy Cost Index to SAP 10. We now have the main program for assessing energy performance certificates. We now have 26 million energy performance certificates in England and Wales, 50% of homes. It's cost us over £1 billion to collect that data. So the data itself has a phenomenal potential value, and we shouldn't forget that, regardless of what model it goes into. As I said, the energy efficiency, the energy cost index is now labelled as an energy efficiency rating, which is confusing for most people who think that EPCs are mostly about efficiency. And in fact, you can only really get an A and a B home if it has photovoltaics, and you can really only get an F and a G home if it's not gas heated. It's nothing to do with the efficiency of the fabric and the heating system. It's to do with the costs and the fact that obviously electricity is much more expensive than gas, and that's why in F and G, most F and G homes are electrically heated. And you also, in order to get an A and B, need to have some generation of electricity to offset the standing charges. The use of the ratings has expanded massively compared to the original objectives. And I think this is part of the confusion. People then want to use this tool that was designed for one particular to answer one particular question, which is now being used for fuel poverty, for assessing various government schemes like MEES and ECO, which are various energy efficiency programs that the government is targeting. And of course, now we also have a potential to target as being an EPCC by 2035. So EPCs have become a key tool for delivering building net zero, and they will need to evolve quite significantly. The core model has evolved from a variable base degree day calculation to a monthly semi-steady state calculation, and potentially could evolve in the future to a full simulation model. It's a lot more complex than it was, as we've got more complex systems in our homes, like heat pumps and other technical systems. I would argue that we now have polarized views about the EPCs. Some people will say that they're essential for saving the planet. I would probably be more in that camp, saying that we have to evolve them in a way that they can support that. But also lots of people have concerns about their accuracy and want to just trash them and just say that they're just not giving us the answers that we want. Given that it's taken 4 decades to get here, what I'm now going to focus on is try to say, well, now that we've had 4 decades, how accurate are the EPCs. And to help us understand how accurate they are, we have used data from the Searle Observatory. The Searle Observatory is 13,000 homes that are roughly representative of the Great British household population, where we have half-hourly electricity and gas data, we have tariff data, we have data about location, we have data about the local weather at an hourly resolution, and we have for half the homes an energy performance certificate. So this data set allows us to compare the actual metered data with what the energy performance certificates predict. And we also know quite a bit, we have quite a bit of other contextual data about the homes, the occupants, and what they do. And in particular, whether the occupants behave in the same way that the standard normative calculations that many models attempt to do with assumed occupant behaviours have. I'll talk about that later. So the overall sort of conclusion slide of our initial analysis of this data is summarised in this graph, which shows you the A to G rating of homes that they have, their EPCs, and compares the modelled energy consumption for those homes against their metered energy consumption. What you observe is that the modelled is sort of increasing, as you would expect. Homes that have a worse EPC band have a higher energy consumption. The axis here is primary energy use intensity. What I guess is slightly concerning is that F and G homes predict 50% more energy use than is metered. It's quite a significant difference. And there's little difference in metered energy use between bands C and G, given that what we're trying to do is move all of these homes over here, being C-rated homes. There's some concern about whether you would get the improvements that might be expected. Bizarrely, you probably would do, and I'll come to that later on. But it's one of the reasons that's driven us to try to unpick this in more detail and explain later on how we're doing that. Note, this is only for gas-heated homes, and we've eliminated PVs and EVs so that we're doing a sort of like-for-like comparison. How SAP can model PVs, but there's some sort of known limitations with that. Obviously, electric vehicles is a sort of unmodeled energy use in SAP.
And you said earlier that there weren't any gas-heated homes that were FGs.
Yeah,
You obviously got
I
small.
said most homes.
But is it a reliable sample out there?
It's a much smaller sample as you get away from C's and D's. You're absolutely right. The sample sizes are much smaller. And the paper that's referenced here has all the detailed information. But you're right, it is an issue. We have done a separate study looking at electrically heated homes, and the results are, if anything, slightly worse with electrically heated homes in terms of some of the gaps. So one question we could pose is, who's responsible for this gap? Is it building physicists who developed the wrong core model? Is it the government who set the method for implementing sort of EPC metrics and all the defaults that go into any model? There are loads of defaults that have to be used regardless of which model you're using. Is it the EPC assessor who always gets the brunt of many of the accusations of making errors? Is it the energy efficiency installers who just don't install the technology properly and therefore we don't get benefit from it? Here too, in some cases. Is it the occupants who don't use the building as specified or took the benefits as comfort? Or is it the scientists and analysts who do not do the energy measurements correctly? We sometimes always blame the models, and assume that the meter data is always 100% efficient. There's no error in that term. So I think we always have to be careful in terms of that. And really, it's this whole ecosystem of the core model, the input assumptions, and the EPC process that can result in the gap. I would argue it's all of them are probably responsible. So this is a representation similar to the previous graph you saw, but a slightly different way of presenting it. So this is the model energy consumption on the bottom axis, the measured on the vertical axis. And if the model predicted absolutely accurately everything, then you'd expect everything to lie on the one-to-one line with perfect agreement between the model and the measured. So which buildings perform well in the model?
Wait, Taj, why have you said including appliances?
Because the models, the standard SAP model, only takes into account regulated energy consumption. We have added the non-regulated using the SAP calculation that calculates the non-regulated energy consumption to work out the internal heat gains in the building, but it doesn't use it in the actual SAP rating. So we've added that, so we are comparing apples with apples.
Some of which is based on square meters.
It's based on some square meters, yeah.
I mean, the difficulty is some of that's based on the number of people who should live in that size house.
Yes, that's right. So there's an assumption about occupancy, which I'll come to in a minute. So which type of homes is this good at?
A and B stands the reason.
And it is a trick question. The klaxons go off, sirens, and the lights start flashing. The reason being that actually two errors cancel out. And so it appears that it's working well, but we have identified errors in the model which actually effectively cancel out on A's and B's. And so actually A's and B's slope goes the other way. To bring that into account, which we have done in future work that we've been doing. It's possible to look at comparing new homes against existing homes. And obviously, most new homes are A and B rated, so it's possible to identify whether it's A and B that appear to be correct. Oops, sorry. Or it's new homes. But it's important to realise that new homes are rated differently from existing homes. New homes are rated for the purpose of building regulations, so all of the construction details are known, and they're lodged, they're input into the calculation, whereas if you have an existing house, all of that information is not lodged. And so an EPC assessor for £60 has to guess all of the information. And so one of the potential causes of a gap is that difference. And we know that there is a difference between these two systems because 70% of homes which are rated B as new using a full SAP calculation as opposed to reduced data SAP calculation, when they're sold, are actually rated as C. And I would be cheesed off if I had bought a B-rated new home, and then when I came to sell it, I only got a C for it. But that is the reality of the system that has been set up. And one of the things that we have been trying to encourage government to do is to give the data that was collected when a building was built to an assessor who then later on assesses that building when it's subsequently sold again, and not make up all the numbers from scratch, because at least those numbers should have been checked by a building control officer and should have a much more rigorous process in terms of validation than an assessor trying to basically rely on what were the typical values for a home when it was constructed at that age, which is what happens with a reduced data SAP. It uses a lot of defaults of the age of the property. So obviously you get what you pay for. This shows you the cost range of EPCs for a single family home in different bits of Europe, all of whom have an EPC rating system. And what you see here is that in Denmark, there's almost an order of magnitude greater cost to having an EPC than there is in the UK. Generally, UK EPCs are one of the cheapest ones. It used to be the case, and I don't know whether it still is, but in the very early days in Denmark, they would take a drill out and drill through your floorboards to find out if you had insulation. And they would drill through the walls to find out if you had insulation. There's some reason or other, this just seems to be completely unacceptable in the UK that we would contemplate doing that to collect reliable data about the energy performance of our homes.
And are they all required to use the same assumptions in their modeling for EPC?
No, each country has its own. They all have to report an EPC at point of sale or rent, and it has to be it has to include a report of primary energy use intensity, which is what I have plotted on the vertical axis. But interestingly, there is similar results to the results I presented here in systems in other countries.
So that price includes somebody physically visiting the property.
Yes.
Well,
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, as I say, you get what you pay for. Which, if you're thinking that in the longer term, you know, lots of homes are, what's the average price of a home? £300,000. And, you know, if you can't sell your house because it isn't a C-rated house, and you're only paying 60 quid for this, it just seems slightly, given the value that is attributed to an EPC, the cost of collecting one seems to be disproportionate to it. And there are, I believe, lots of things that could be done to improve that. So coming on to the important point of occupancy and the fact that SAP makes standard assumptions about occupancy. So occupancy does make a difference to the energy consumption. And because we ask all of our SERL participants questions like how many occupants are there, what do they set their thermostat at, we can look to see whether their energy consumption differs as a result of that. And this is what we find, is that yes, the more occupants you have, the more measured energy there is in the building. And also the higher the thermostat temperature, the more energy consumption there is. But what is slightly worrying is that the gradient is always still the same. It's not on the one-to-one line. It's a much, much, much flatter gradient.
You're comparing somebody who says there's only one occupant in my house.
Yes.
With what the EPC assumes based on the square meters.
No, what you can then do is do what I think you're looking for, which is to only look at the houses that behave like SAP assumes. So only the houses that have the number of occupants that SAP assumes and the thermostat set point temperature. And they say that they heat their whole house and they keep their living room comfortably warm and they're not struggling financially. So those are the people marked here as yes, occupants behave like SAP. And these are the ones that don't behave like SAP assumes. And what we had hoped for was when we did this analysis, yes, would go spot on the one-to-one line when we took all of that into account. So occupancy makes a difference, but it doesn't appear to make a difference to the gradient. The gradient in some ways is a real problem because you know what you're ultimately comparing is one house and one band against. Not getting the improvement in reduction in energy consumption. Why is that? So based on all of that analysis, we came up with some narratives following that, which we did in 2020. Homes are not achieving SAP levels of comfort was one of the things that we said, and we've looked at that, but that doesn't fully explain the gap, because most explanations, and people have been aware of this gap, almost always the explanation is the poorly insulated homes just aren't heated to the level that they should be or that SAP assumes. But this suggested that doesn't fully explain this gap. We also hypothesized that homes improved since they were rated. So, many of these ratings can be up to 10 years old, and we're metering, many years after that. And so, there could be improvements to those homes, more low energy lights, obviously, more better technology that goes in, a whole host of things that could happen to those houses that SAP wasn't, that the old EPC wasn't correctly capturing. We're very aware that there's less electrical power consumption for lights and appliances that SAP predicts, just because technologies have just improved so much, which impacts particularly on the primary energy analysis and incidental heat gains in the calculation. So that could be improved. Also, we know that the SAP algorithms make some heroic assumptions about what the internal temperature is and how that changes, and could be improved. We're also aware that SAP may be over-optimistic about efficiency in new building, but in a reduced data SAP in existing buildings, it may be pessimistic. And the reason for that is if you are wanting to commission a SAP for your existing building, what are the two things that you want from your EPC? I would argue the two things most people want from their EPC is not necessarily a good EPC. They just want it as quickly as possible because they can't sell their house until they get it as quickly as possible. And they want it as cheaply as possible. And those two things put pressure on assessors to default to the age defaults that the reduced data SAP calculation has in it. And so that's why they move towards the pessimistic side of things, because they're not really being incentivized to go further. If you can't get access to your loft, you just assume there's no loft insulation. And obviously, if you're in a panic and your homeowners aren't necessarily there and can let you into the loft, then you just basically don't visit the loft. If you haven't got cavity wall installation certificate, then the assessor will simply assume for the age band what the default values of the house are. Whereas for a full SAP calculation, which new build has done, there's a lot of pressure to get a good rating. And that's because you won't get through the building regulations. And so there is a driver to get a good sort of optimistic SAP rating, but a pessimistic RD SAP. And then there's also some evidence about wrong assumptions in RD SAP for U values. So to try and get to the bottom of these various hypotheses, we got a project funded by DESNES to try and unpick some of these issues. And the way we have been able to unpick some of these issues is that whereas for the original piece of work, we were just reliant on the EPC data for that home, that was in the public register. And that tells you what the EPC is and a bit of information about that. But if you want to use the current weather that was then there when you measured the energy consumption, you can't remodel that house. And if you want to put in improvements to the house that might have happened since the EPC was originally issued, you can't rerun them all because you don't have all the EPC input data. Well, MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, has all of that data. It's sitting on a big desk, and they very kindly gave it to us for the 13,000 homes that we have. So we were able to build a full SAP model and play with it. And not only were we able to play with it, so we were able to play with it and put in the real occupancy number and the real set point temperature in it and a whole host of other things. But we were also able to extract not just the annual energy, primary energy use intensity, which is the publicly available number. We were able to look at how much gas, how much electricity the SAP was predicting, and how it was predicting it on a monthly basis. And that monthly basis allowed us to understand how much of the energy use was for hot water and space heating hot water and cooking compared to space heating, because we were able to look at the monthly figures, and I'll show you some. While we were doing this, just the act of being able to build a model of an EPC, EPC model for each of our homes, was incredibly a useful thing to prove. We've proven that it is possible automatically for the government to reissue a new EPC for any house that's had a boiler replaced or any other measure that is actually lodged by government. And it's possible to do that. So it's possible to have what we call a living EPC, and it would be possible for any homeowner to input their use of the building, the data they had, and automatically update all the information. And that's one of the things that we're proposing government should do, because it would give much greater value and a more realistic data. So we also were able to revisit 40 of the homes that had gaps and send an expert assessor to find out how much of the gap was due to original EPC assessor error, how much of it was to do with some changes that happened to the house since the original EPC was done, and how much of it was to do with changes to the EPC process since the original EPC was done. So we did this forensic investigation. And then we were also able to look at mean internal temperatures, modelled and measured. And the combined methods provide actually a very detailed explanation of what are the causes of the gap. And as a result of the results from that, we believe it would be possible to quite easily modify the SAP calculation to both produce a better rating system and to give better predictions for homeowners with relatively little, if maybe even no, increased cost in some cases, and possibly.
Are you saying you were able to come up with an EPC which matched consumption?
Well, no, that wasn't what we tried to do. Let me just show you the next graphs, and then I'll answer that question. Hopefully. So what we had here was, so by the time we'd filtered everything out that could cause any noise, we ended up 7 homes where we had the monthly gas and electricity consumption. We then took a whole host of different data sets that we had got hold of, data sets about what the building was constructed, all the data that an EPC assessor collects, data about the vintage of the EPC, the actual weather, the efficiency improvements that had happened to the house that were lodged in the needs database, and behaviour data that was self-reported, and feed that into our models. And so we could do a base model where none of these other things were corrected for, but then we could correct for just having the most recent version of RD-SAP, so no historic versions of the SAP calculation. We could update it with the real weather. We could update it with upgrades to the house that we were aware of that had happened to the house, and we could update it with the real occupancy. And we could look at the data on a monthly basis and also on an energy signature basis, and also do a linear regression. I'm not going to go through all of the details on this, but just I want to spend a bit of time just talking about the energy signature method, which is again plotting the energy consumption. And SAP only predicts the monthly energy consumption. We can look at the monthly energy consumption and how it varies with external temperature in theory and using metered data. And this shows you some daily metered data showing you that you get this energy signature where you get this flat bit in the summer and you get this gradient in the winter time. And the gradient tells you something about the heat loss divided by the heating system efficiency. So a very steep gradient is a very inefficient home. A very shallow gradient is a very efficient home in terms of heat loss and heating system efficiency. The base load tells you the non-space heating energy use. And because we have that broken down in gas heated homes for gas and electricity, we can separate out the algorithms for lights and appliances as opposed to hot water and space heat and gas cooking. And the inflection point is the balance temperature, the temperature at which the heating system comes on at. It's not the set point temperature as defined before. And in some ways, it's bizarre that we haven't really got to the bottom of this before, because this is data that's 2 decades old that shows modelled heat loss from a SAT calculation against the measured heat loss of a building. And you get this sort of crossover point where sort of in the middle, the average heat loss is roughly right, but there's a lot of scatter. But as you go to poorly insulated homes, they're actually performing better than SAP assumes, and well-insulated homes are performing worse. You could hypothesize a reason for that, and the reason that I would hypothesize is that in buildings with no insulation at all, air gaps are good because air gaps actually provide a bit of insulation. And it's very difficult to build buildings without air gaps and trapped air pockets in them. Whereas if you've got an insulated fabric, air gaps are bad because they can allow thermal bypass, they can allow circulation around, because the air isn't as good an insulator as the insulation itself. And so, you know, you could hypothesize an explanation for that for this type of graph, but this type of graph, sort of aware of. So just some concluding personal reflections. The good news is that the Great British housing stock is better than we think from EPCs. There are a lot of homes that we think are Ds, Es, Fs, Gs that are probably 1 band or more better because they've been improved since their original EPC. And the less efficient older properties are generally even better than the average, in part because they've had more upgrades since they were rated. So you know, houses that started off being very inefficient are more likely to have had more efficiency improvements than those homes that are already efficient aren't going to have that many efficiency improvements. Occupants can make a big difference to energy use, but are not the only explanation for a gap. And modelers and analysts get things wrong all the time. And occupant behavior is normally the soft target for these unexplained results. I could give you a very good example of a paper saying that energy efficiency improvements all disappear after 4 years, which was
No, it wasn't. It was from Cambridge.
from Cambridge, and it was a very good example of analysts getting things wrong and blaming the occupant for it by saying the occupants had rebounded massively and all the efficiency improvements had gone on extensions and everything else. But we do this all the time. It's been done with EPCs. Like I say, the gap has almost always been explained away by saying that people don't behave like the models assume. In fact, the analysis we have done and will be publishing suggests that houses are much warmer than actually SAP assumes. You know, it's the opposite effect. The EPC gap has many causes: model assumptions, EPC processes, all of which go on at the same time. And the temptation is always to look at one cause of a problem and not look at it in the round. I've been guilty of that as well. And when we've actually started to unpick things, we found that, that actually there are many things in the EPC process, the model, the process, that can be easily improved. No gap, no problem model validated. Again, we've seen errors cancelling each other out. And you really do need to test the validity of models across the whole user space in enough detail across the whole user space to unpick the ways in which errors can cancel each other. There's a difference between research and business policy models, and I would argue that SAP is a business policy model. It's not a researcher model. If you're developing a business policy model, you have to balance between accuracy, reliability, value, and cost, and all of these things. And reliability has been a key focus in the past, but it isn't the only thing. Reliability is you send 10 assessors and you get the same answer with it. Well, the simple way of looking at that is, well, okay, we'll just assess the EPC based on the colour of the house, and we can guarantee every assessor will get the same sort of reliability in that assessment. Then we'll say it's green, or unless they're colourblind. The other thing that you have to be aware of with a business or policy model is that it will be gamed. And there are lots of examples of the gaming that goes on in these sorts of models. And in terms of, and even in sort of gaming of physical measurements to replace predictions. The key metric that you might want to use to energy rate a house obviously can change over time. What is the role of energy efficiency in a decarbonised world? What is it we're wanting to be able to compare in that type of scenario where everything's decarbonised? You wouldn't want to have a CO2 rating in that. Are you trying to minimise the peak demands on the electricity system? And I think we have to be realistic that no model is good at everything. And I think trying to design a model that is good at everything can end up with being a hostage to fortune, that it's not good at anything really good at. I would argue that validation is not just for Christmas. Technologies and practices and climate are all changing. And therefore, you would expect the way in which models model things and predict things to change as a result of that, with different assumptions and different ways of actually handling the modeling. Obviously, the most two recent things is COVID. We've obviously changed the way we might use our homes. We might work from our homes much more. And obviously, there's been the cost of living crisis, which has radically reduced energy consumption in many homes, particularly in poorer homes. The more complex a model, the more assumptions you need to validate, which is something that I think is sometimes overlooked. I do believe access to administrative linked data is revolutionising metered in-use variables and contextual data that can both validate, but also, in some cases, possibly replace models as well. And I think it will have a significant impact in the future. AI is a game changer, but AI needs feeding with good data. And you do need to be careful not to assume that all data is good for everything. And so, for example, a lot of people forget that the need annualized electricity data is only import data. It doesn't have export data, and so doesn't give credit to PVs the same way that is actual reality. I just wanted to finish off with where I basically started, which is that we do need to probably haven't been critical of ourselves enough in this field, given that it's taken us 4 decades to get to where we are in terms of trying to explain some of these problems. Obviously, science is under threat in many ways, and if we don't double down on rigor and reproducibility and challenge each other on things like this, then I think there will be more openings for people to trash the science behind a lot of what we're trying to promote. And these are the just some, to repeat the acknowledgements and to provide some references.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. So that was brilliant. Not often do we get good news about the UK housing stock. Thank you very much for that. Do you have any questions for Touch? Because I've got a few. Brenda.
I've only got 6 million. At a big level, Taj, I was thinking the other day that the EPCs are predicting that we're more efficient than I believe we are. The way in which they're saying so many are Ds, quite a lot of Cs, I forget where we've got to in the distribution, which is the opposite of what you're saying. I just don't believe we've done that level of energy efficiency improvements that the EPCs appear to be showing. But you are saying we've done better.
Yes.
I thought we had good news and Brenda.
I think we have done better. And so what we found is a large proportion of that gap is due to historic EPCs, not reflecting the changes that have happened to buildings. If you put a new boiler in a house, if you put new glazing, both of which are regulated changes, you have no choice. You don't opt for that. If you go to a gas boiler installer, they have to install a more efficient boiler than is probably the one that you've got if it's more than two years old or so. So you have no choice. You don't know when you're improving the efficiency of your building, but you will do. And heating systems have a big impact because they have a bigger impact than the fabric because they impact not only the space heating but the hot water. So both get reduced. Whereas if you improve just insulation, for example, you don't touch the hot water, don't make that any more efficient. And if you're just doing the fabric and the ventilation stays the same, then you're only doing part of the heat loss of the building. So sometimes I think we don't realize the things that actually have the biggest impact. And, you only need to look around the neighborhoods that, we have had a lot of improvements to homes. I mean, particularly recently. Now, some of those improvements have expanded the home, but during that expansion, you generally have to adhere to building regulations. And most contractors will do that, and you'll have a building control officer who comes around and just checks some of it. But I mean, the normal practice now is that if you're putting an extension, doing things, you will build it to a much higher standard. So you're adding this extra wrapped layer around the house. You might be making it bigger, but actually you might be reducing the heat loss of the building just associated with that. And obviously we've done a lot to our lofts and things. And some of the things are probably happening than we originally thought.
I'd like to return to what's the question we're actually asking,
Yes.
and what is the question that EPCs answered. Originally that was about cost and
Yes.
house buyers ever since. When that was invented, there was roughly about one tariff out there.
Yes.
I've been told, I can't believe the number, but somebody said there's apparently 30,000 tariffs. There's a lot of choice, a lot of different things.
Yes.
Can that come into this?
Well, I mean, it could come into it in terms of my EPC, i.e. you would have yours automatically tailored. And in fact, your smart meter could tell the system automatically what your tariff is for my EPC.
Yeah.
But obviously for a rating system, which is comparing one home against another, independent of occupant behaviour, you have to use some national average tariff.
Right, yeah, which is then, I mean, there's other calls for having some certificates for how flexible that is.
Yes.
So has a hot water tank might have more ability to tap into cheaper tariffs.
Yes.
That's another complexity.
Another complexity. And I think, obviously if you've got a model, it can answer lots of different questions. But to do the flexibility issue, you really need to be capable of modelling half-hourly energy consumption. which is much, much more tricky to do for modeling monthly energy consumption, and probably involves more inputs and therefore more assessor cost and things like that. So yes, I think ultimately that's where we will be going. But we might be doing it using a different label rather than a cost label. I don't know. I mean, there's obviously lots of debate about this, and there's a consultation that is either out now or just completed on what metrics the government should adopt in the future.
And the other thing it's not trying to do is help us with heat loss assessments for heat pump sizing. You said that was one of the big topics
Yes.
coming up.
Yes, yes.
I mean, that's what my personal experience, I was told how to heat my house and disagreed very much with how I actually do it. That put me off the whole process.
Yes. And I mean, I think, that will evolve over time. Go back to a famous quote from the sort of 1950s, I think, where it was predicted that central heating would be the death of family life because we would no longer have a open fire to sit around that brought the family together, but we would now be able to heat the whole house and family would disperse. And they may well have actually been right. Divorce rate might be higher now because of that. Who knows?
Combination of devices.
But we do change over time. I mean, if you try to take away central heating today, there would be an even bigger uproar. And of course, there's an uproar at the moment about continuous heating of homes. Some people who say that it's completely unacceptable. We can't have our heat pumps running all the time.
It feels wrong, doesn't it?
It feels wrong. And our mental models convince us it's wrong because, we understood what a gas boiler was doing vaguely, just like we used to understand what a car was doing vaguely. But now none of us understand how a car works. And now none of us understand how a heat pump works. And we can't really get our heads around that easily. And so, people will have to learn through being sort of educated in some ways about some of these things. And, we might have to give away a summer duvet with every heat pump, because that could be the implication that we don't need two duvets, a summer and winter duvet, if you've got a heat pump. And therefore you would save the storage space that is required for storing your
hot water tank in.
You thought this one. Fantastic. You had a question?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question on, I wonder if you can elaborate on the AI point, and how do you see AI as a game changer? Is it in terms of the data collection process or more on the crunching the numbers? Because on a related note, just today I saw something on the UK algorithmic transparency thing that Warwickshire, I think, are like trialing an AI thing to estimate EPC for homes that don't have EPC weightings yet.
Yeah.
And my immediate reaction was a bit dubious about whether AI can be, because all of the assumptions within the AI and potential risk of AI failures and etc.
Yeah, I mean, you could replace SAP with an AI model and train it on real smart meter data. So it would be possible to do that. Of course, normally the criticism of AI models is that they then don't give you the capability to change things, like what happens if I put PVs on my roof or something like that. But obviously, if you've got a good enough training data set which has all those contextual variables, then you can do that. And basically, we're in the process of doing that with all of the EPC input data that we have. We can do that. We can take the EPC input data, and rather than run SAP through it, we could run a trained model, because we have the half-hourly gas and electricity data, and we could produce a model that uses the same inputs as an EPC assessor produces, and probably get better outputs? Question mark.
Yeah, I think that's usually leveled against AI as lack of explainability, but it turns out we've needed 40 years to explain that. Maybe it's not that high a bar.
But I think there's just endless things that could be done with the analytics that now is being developed, provided you've got the data to train it. And I would argue that the UK is probably better endowed than any country with administrative data and metered data. So we have everybody's annualized meter data in the NEED database. We have, for half the homes, everybody's EPC data. So, we've got massive data sets. At the moment, there's strong restrictions on how those are used. And I would hope that the national, what is it called? The National Data Library that's being proposed by the current government might open up some of the doors that historically, but we've all lived through everybody realizing that data is incredibly important. Smart data is where it's all at. But when it actually comes to getting your hands on it, there are a million and one reasons that any civil service will give you as to why they can't let you have that data.
Can I turn the question back at you? Where do you see the big role for AI? You're probably sort of more grown up with it than us.
I don't know. I'm still a bit dubious because Charlotte, my supervisor, and I are currently trying to map out the AI risks and systemic risks within AI systems to climate risk and energy risk. And we see that there are privacy risks and internal model failure risks associated that might undermine the credibility of such policies and performances programs that might then undermine also public trust to the certification process. So I'm still unsure about whether AI is truly, I appreciate the technical capacities of it, but yeah, still a lot of question mark, as you said.
Well, so, one of the biggest challenges with doing AI in this area is that smart meter data is particularly protected data. It's regulated more than GDPR. It has a smart energy code, which puts quite a lot of constraints on what you were allowed to do with smart meter data. And that was largely due to there being real concern that the rollout of smart meters might be scuppered by concerns about data privacy. And so data privacy is incredibly strongly policed. We are audited every year on our use of the data and the collection of it. And, we have consent from our homeowners to do what we do, but it does put heavy constraints on things. And there is a real issue about, if you then push all this data into an AI thing, how much of that original data is somewhere there in the whole system, and to what extent is it truly anonymized? And there's a lot of interest, and I know that Phil and your PhD students has been starting to look at that, and colleagues are also looking at that whole challenge, because we would like to create synthetic data files that wouldn't have the constraints. But again, we'd have to be incredibly careful that these synthetic data files didn't release any personal information.
But your skepticism would be very welcome in that. Super, Touch. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got a few more questions where we probably can roll them into the evening. Yeah. Which leads me to thank you and alert you to next week's talk, which is on a completely different topic, just to show you the wide range that we've got. Ian Wilkinson is going to talk about building up a hydrogen economy. You will notice hydrogen to come up here, so we'll see what that's all good for then. So that's next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Touch.
Much data. But all I'll make 2 comments.
Yep.
Right. I mean,
That's a very good point, but it might have a few effects. I think Nick. prices are quite
I
sensitive.
get say.
If the spark ratio was 1:1, so presumably they mean gas is as expensive as electricity
Yeah.
rather than electricity as cheap as gas. In which case you have some people struggling with their gas bill.
As assumed that if your gas was going hydrogen, it has to be more expensive than electricity because you make your own electricity. This is like, yeah, we've moved
The
from
other
one
one was
where you make electricity out of gas to one where you make gas out of
Because
electricity. It's
query
it has that effect.
ages
Yeah,
ago
it's not going to be cheaper. That was one of my favourite talk
about
lines about carbon capture and storage.